Everybody. I trust that you are well and also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today we'll be doing our grade 8 English lesson on direct and indirect objects. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once you've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of English Language Arts grade 8. Then we're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of direct and indirect objects. All right. We said our chapter is direct and indirect objects. Our subject is English Language Arts, grade 8. The lesson that we are going to be focusing on today under the chapter of direct and indirect objects is it a direct object or an indirect object? So is it a direct object or an indirect object? All right. So when it comes to a direct object, right, or an indirect object, but we'll first start with a direct object. A direct object, right, it is the pronoun, the noun, or it is a noun phrase that receives the action of the verb. So once again, a direct object is the pronoun, a noun, or noun phrase that receives the action of a verb. And in order for us to find a direct object within a sentence, we need to locate the action verb and we need to ask ourselves what or whom it is acting on. So we say that in order for us to find in a sentence, remember we say the direct object is either the pronoun, the noun, or the noun phrase that receives of the verb. So in order for us to find the direct object within that sentence, to find the pronoun, to find the noun, or to find the noun phrase, we need to locate the action verb, we need to find the action verb, or identify the action verb, and ask ourselves what is acting on it or whom is acting on it. And if we look at an example, right, of a direct object, it says Jane admires her neighbor. So Jane admires her neighbor. So if we look at that sentence, right, then we need to ask ourselves, whom does Jane admire? So which means that she admires her neighbor. So which means that her neighbor is then the direct object within the sentence. Because it tells us whom she is, basically who is being located. And then if we look at the next sentence, right, it says Charlie baked a cake. Charlie baked a cake. And if we look at that sentence, right, we need to ask ourselves, what did Charlie bake? It says Charlie baked a cake. So the question is, what did Charlie bake? And a cake is our direct object because it tells us what Charlie baked. All right. And then you said that it's a direct object, right? But also with a direct object, right, we also have an indirect object, right? So some verbs that have a direct object can also have an indirect object. And an indirect object, it is the pronoun or it is the noun or it is the noun phrase that receives the direct object of the verb. So it receives the direct object of the group. And if we look at what the indirect object is. I said, firstly, the indirect object, right? It always appears in between a verb and it appears in between an object. So once again, a direct object or an indirect object, right? Because we said a direct object, it is the pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the action of the verb. And in order for us to find the direct object within a sentence, we need to find or locate the action verb. And we need to ask ourselves what it is acting on or whom it is acting on. And some of the verbs that have a direct object, right, can also have an indirect object. An indirect object is the pronoun or the noun phrase that receives the direct object of the verb. And the indirect object, it always appears in between a verb as well as its direct object. So it's in between the verb and the direct object. And in order for us to find the indirect object, to locate the indirect object or to find the indirect object within the sentence, then we need to locate the action verb and we need to locate the direct object and ask ourselves to what, not just what, but to what or to whom the direct object is being given, or for what or for whom the action is being performed, right? So the indirect object receives the direct object of the verb. It appears between the verb and the direct object. And in order for us to indicate the object of the verb that are the indirect object, to find the indirect object, we need to locate the action verb and we need to locate the direct object. Because the reason why we need to locate both action verb as well as the direct object is because we said that the indirect object will always appear between the verb and the indirect object. So that is why you need to locate the action verb as well as the direct object when you find the indirect object of the sentence. And once we do, then we need to ask ourselves to what or to whom the direction is being given, or for what or for whom the action is being performed. All right, so now we're going to look at examples of indirect objects. And remember, we said that an indirect object will appear between a direct object as well as an action verb. Let me do this. All right. And if we look at examples of indirect objects, right, then it says Charlie baked his mom a cake. So Charlie baked his mom a cake. Remember in our direct object, we said Charlie baked a cake, right? So we had to ask ourselves, what did Charlie bake? And we said it was a cake. And a cake was our direct object, right? But now we're saying Charlie baked his mom a cake, right? So baked is our verb. I'm going to put V for verb. A cake is our direct object. And remember, we said that in order for us to locate or to find our indirect object, you will find it between the action verb as well as the direct object, right? Which means that here we have our verb, over here we have our direct object, which means that his mom will then be our direct indirect object. So his mom will then be our indirect object. And as you can see where our indirect object is, it is in between our action verb as well as our direct object. Remember, we say that an indirect object is either a pronoun or the noun or noun receives the direct object. And the indirect object will always appear in between. It will always appear in between a verb and a direct object, right? Charlie baked his mom a cake. Baked is our action verb. A cake was our direct object, which means that our indirect object, right? The question that we need to even ask for whom the action is being performed is his mom, because Charlie baked his mom a cake. For whom did Charlie bake a cake? For his mom. So his mom is the indirect object within the sentence. And if we look at another example, right, we can say, okay, before we go on to the example, right, remember we said that an indirect object appears between our verb as well as our direct object, right? It tells us either to whom or for what or to what the action is being performed, right? Or to it's being given. You need to be careful not to confuse an indirect object with an object of a preposition, right? So, once again, you need to be careful not to confuse an indirect object with an object of a preposition. And an object of a preposition, right? It is a pronoun, a noun, or noun phrase that comes directly after a preposition. It comes directly after a preposition, which is words such as to, for, in, under, or during, right? So if either the pronoun or noun phrase comes directly after a preposition, and the prepositions are words such as to, so if it comes directly after a word such as to, for, in, under, or during, then that is an object of preposition, right? It is not an action verb, it is not a direct object, it's an object of preposition. And if we're going to look at an example, right? And then you can compare the example that we're going to make now to this example over here where we identified our indirect object. This is our indirect object, right? So you're going to look at this example and you can compare it with our first example that we made where we had identified correctly what the indirect object is. It says Charlie baked a cake for his mom. So Charlie baked a cake for his mom. And if we look at that sentence, right, then the object of preposition will then be the let's say his mom will then be the object of preposition. I'm gonna say OP, object of preposition, because it comes after the preposition which is for. So for is our preposition. I'm gonna put P for preposition. A cake is our direct object, and baked is our action verb. So which means that his mom within the sentence, it is our object of preposition. And it's the object of preposition because it is not a direct object. And the reason why it's an object of preposition because it comes after our preposition, which is for. And also, right, we said that an indirect object, it always appears in between a verb and in between the direct object. And as you can see, his mom is basically, it is basically after the preposition. Here we have baked, which is our verb, and we have a cake, which is our direct object. I'm going to put DO for direct object, right? So we need to be careful not to confuse a direct object or a direct, or let's say an indirect object with an object of preposition. Because the object of preposition, it is a pronoun, a noun, or a noun phrase that comes directly after preposition, such as it comes after to, or after for, or after, in, under, or during, right? That means it's an object of preposition. And an indirect object, just to clarify, just to clear, it is, or it basically always appears between a verb and a direct object, right? So let us not confuse that. All right, so now let's go to our aplusstudents.ca, and we are going to focus on the lesson that says, is it a direct object or an indirect object? Right? And we went over what a direct object is. We said a direct object is a pronoun, noun, or noun that receives the action of a verb. And in order for us to find the direct object within a sentence, we need to locate the action verb and ask ourselves what or whom it is acting on. And then also we have an indirect object, right? So with every direct object, right, some of the verbs that have a direct object also has an indirect object. An indirect object is a pronoun, noun, or noun phrase that receives the direct object of the verb. And a direct object, right, or an indirect object always appears between a verb and it appears between a direct object. And in order for us to find the indirect object in a sentence, we need to locate the action verb and its direct object and ask to what or to whom the direct object is being given, or for what or for whom the action is being performed. And remember, we said that we need to be careful not to confuse an indirect object with with an object of preposition, right? So, a object of preposition, right? It is a pronoun, noun, and noun phrase. It comes directly after a preposition. All right. So now we're going to do this activity where we're going to say, is the phrase in bold a direct object or an indirect object? It says in 1983, University awarded Alice Walker the Pulitzer Prize for her novel The Color Purple. So in 1983, Columbia University awarded Alice Walker the Pulitzer Prize for her novel The Color Purple. We need to say is the Pulitzer Prize if that is a direct object or if it's an indirect object. And if we were to identify our direct object, or let's say if we were to say if it is a direct or indirect object, then we would say this is a direct object, right? And there it comes after our verb, which is awarded. All right. We need to say, is the phrase in bold a direct object or if it's an indirect object? Camille built her clients a sleek new website. So Camille built her clients a sleek new website. And if we were to select if it is a direct object or indirect object, we will say this is a sleek new website is a direct object. Because we need to say what did what did Camille build her clients? She built her clients a sleek new website. All right. The next one says we need to say is in bold a direct object or if it's an indirect object. And it says Bryce's new job affords him much more freedom than his previous one. So Bryce's new job affords him much more freedom than his previous one. So we need to say is that if the phrase in bold is either a direct object or if it's an indirect object. All right. And if we were to say if it's a direct or indirect object, we would say much more freedom, right, is a direct object. And the reason why it is a direct object, right, is because we need to ask ourselves a question: what does Bryce's new job afford him? So, what does Bryce's new job afford him? And to answer that question, Bryce's new job affords him much more freedom, right? If we were to compare to the old job. So that is a direct object. All right. So now we're going on to our test where we are going to say is it a direct object and indirect object. All right, so is the phrase in bold a direct or an indirect object? It says Coach King through a swim team and end of season party. So Coach King threw her swim team and end of season party. So we need to say is that a direct object or an indirect object? And we will ask ourselves the question, what did Coach King throw her swim team? And she threw her swim team an end season party, which means that it's a direct object. So direct object is correct. We need to say is this phrase in bold a direct object or an indirect object? The phrase in bold, which is a sleek new website. It says Camille built her clients a sleek new website. So Camille built her clients a sleek new website. So sleek new website, is that a direct object or an indirect object? We need to ask ourselves, what did Camille build her clients? So what did Camille build her clients? And if we were to answer the question of say of what Camille built her clients, then we would say a sleek new website, which means that this is a direct object. All right, we need to say if the word in bold is a direct object or an indirect object. It says Wendy owes Maki $20 for last night's dinner. So Wendy owes Maki $20 for last night's dinner. Is this a direct object or indirect object? Maki. So we need to ask ourselves to whom or for whom does Wendy owe $20 for last night's dinner? So we can say it is for Maki. So this is our indirect object and it comes between our action verb as well as our direct object. It says Harry caught us a huge catfish for lunch. So Harry caught us a huge catfish for lunch. So we need to say if that is a direct object or if it's an indirect object. So we need to ask ourselves, what did Harry catch us for lunch? And we will say he caught us a huge catfish for lunch. So huge catfish is our direct object. We need to say if the phrase in bold, which is fresh blackberry pie, if that is an object or a direct object, or if it's an indirect object. Fresh blackberry pie. And if we look at our sentence, it says the pie shop owner happily baked Farah a fresh blackberry pie for her birthday, for her party. So the pie shop owner happily baked Farah a fresh blackberry pie for her party. We need to say if the words, which is fresh blackberry pie, if it's a direct object or an indirect object. So, what did the shop owner Farah bake? Or what did the shop owner happily bake Farah? And we can say she baked a fresh blackberry pie for her party, which is a direct object. Remember, we said that the direct object, it shows who it's directed to, right? And then with an indirect object, right, it's like you ask, it's basically in between an action verb as well as the direct object, right? So then we say it's for whom or to whom, right? Because now it's also being directed to it, but it is between. It's always in between a action verb as well as a direct object. That is an indirect object. All right, so now we're going to the next one that says, is the phrase in bold, which is delicious herb roasted chicken. We need to say if that phrase in either a direct object or an indirect object. And the sentence is, Connor prepared his family a delicious herb roasted chicken for dinner. So Connor prepared his family a delicious herb roasted chicken for dinner. So we need to say what Connor prepared for his family, or prepared his family for dinner. All right, so we can say Connor prepared his family a delicious roasted chicken for dinner. And we can say that is a direct object. All right, let's do the last one. And the last one is we need to say if the phrase, which is extra cannoli, we need to say if that is a direct object or if it's an indirect object. It says, our sentence is, at our favorite Italian restaurant, my father always orders us an extra cannoli for dessert. So at our favorite Italian restaurant, my father always orders us an extra cannoli for dessert. So we need to say if extra cannoli is a direct object or an indirect object. And we will say that it is a direct object because it says what our father always orders for dessert. All right, so that's the end of our lesson on direct and indirect objects. All right, we see the direct object. It basically shows us to who or to what it is being directed. And then with every direct object is also an indirect object, right? And our indirect object, it comes in between our action verb as well as our direct object within the sentence. All right, so this is the end of our lesson. Thank you very much, grade 8s, for joining our class, and I really hope that you're going to have a good evening further. So, till next time, goodbye.